that life gives me and survive the bad. I will make both as positive as I possibly can. Straight A's are what is expected of me, or you. Kaniqua scheduled an appointment and told the receptionist that she suffered from crippling depression since as far back as she could remember, possibly since her teenage years, and she hoped someone could find a way to help her. Upon coming into the office, she presented as an emotionally exhausted woman in her late 40s with a long history of stress-related physical health issues, who, despite being very well spoken and energetically likable, seemed to be bathing in despair and hopelessness. The more she spoke, the harder it was to find the root cause for all of her unhappiness and catastrophic expectations in life. She had a decent relationship with her second husband, who seemed to be loyal and affectionate by her own description, and her children seemed to be fairly attentive and successful at life. Regardless of how these parts of her life were reviewed and interpreted, and regardless of how well her job went, Kaniqua was subject to deep and dark moods of swirling negativity and an expectation of failure both from the world and environment around her, and even by her own efforts. As the sessions proceeded, Kaniqua began to give evidence that she believed the problems all stemmed from her own lack of ability to manage life correctly or to just get things right. This belief seemed deeply embedded within her. Puzzled as to where this sense of personal failure and unworthiness originally came from, her therapist pushed backwards to track her developmental history and reviewed the values and beliefs she was presented with during her formative years. She told a tale of being raised by loving but strict parents who focused almost exclusively on scholastic performance as their expectation of their children, and especially of her as the only daughter. Time and again, Kaniqua remembered. She worried and obsessed over her grades, and the day report cards came out and dreaded her parents' response, to which she knew would always be disappointment. Despite her considerable efforts, she never lived up to their standards, as they told her repeatedly, straight A's are what we expect, that's what you're supposed to get, and she was, at best, an A-B student. This inability to never reach her parents' expectations had been internalized so deeply, and her desire to please them was so strong, that these two dynamics combined together caused a deep sense of personal failure and unworthiness in Kaniqua. This sense of unworthiness and failure grew and festered over the years and created all the self-esteem issues and depression that have poisoned her life up to that point. The absolute most depressed, hopeless, and despondent individuals that have ever walked into my office were the ones who had this drilled into their heads as children, and ultimately accepted this. It is not the least bit unusual to hear either, as it is a common thing for parents to say to their children. Whether the parents were trying to instill their children a much-needed ethic, or perhaps the ability to strive, struggle, and fight for survival and success and overdid it, or whether they deliberately tried to set unreasonable and unattainable standards so they would never have to award deserved approval, or whether they deliberately tried to set unreasonable and unattainable standards so they would never have to award deserved approval. The effects of the effects are usually devastating on the ones trying to live by the standards. It is a giant black cloud of despair and hopelessness that never loosens its grip. It gradually absorbs all the hope and brightness out of these children and subsequent adults, and leaves them exhausted, seeing no end to their misery. Let's talk about why this saying has such a negative effect on children and later adults. I'm going to start with the formulation premise that children are consumers. I'm going to start with a foundational premise that children are consumers. on an emotional level with their parents and the world around them, and that is perfectly normal. Children are blank screens when they come into the world, who necessarily absorb from their caretakers a complete sense of who they are and what the world around them is, and what they need, and that they need their parents or whomever the designated caretaker is to help them develop an essential sense of their character traits, value, and how they should expect the world to see them. Anyone who has had children knows this is true in a very personal way and has a very good sense of just how powerful and overwhelming this need can be, as well as how powerful children's need for their caregiver's attention is by nature. Returning to our own youth, try and jump temporarily into a time machine and remember how much you yourself sought and craved that energy, that attention, and that approval from your own personal overlords, and think about just how far you would have gone to get it. I have seen adults in their 50s and 60s who still desperately thirst for and chase that parental approval. These older adults partake in actions that are demeaning and show a complete lack of self-respect and dignity in order to try and capture that precious treasure that they believe will be so satisfying, bringing a sense of completion and wholeness to their lives. While it is a fruitless quest at that point in life, it is, however, understandable that children expect and need that initial validation that they are worth being on the planet, knowing that their parents are pleased with them and validate who they are. Now, if you accept the above paragraph's premise about how badly children need and will chase this validation, let's consider the effect of straight A's are expected and why it is just a damaging value. What you are either saying or being told is that in either the literal or figurative classroom of life, that only absolute perfection is acceptable, and no degree of success except absolute success is what you should achieve. The problem with this whole value is the expected part. What is being said is that if you manage to somehow struggle, claw, fight to achieve a complete set of A's, that when you go to present this accomplishment to your primary judge, that they will say, well, that's what you were supposed to do, and then walk away with all that approval still tucked away safely in their pocket. That's right. If you achieve absolute perfection, then you get nothing. Nada. Zilch. What you will get is an absence of punishment. So in essence, someone living in this world is living in the same framework as the Hebrew slaves who built the pyramids by hauling giant blocks up the steps and hoping not to taste the whips from their masters by not making any mistakes that would call attention to themselves and bring down punishment. Imagine how depressing it would be to live in a world where you could never, ever achieve not one moment of praise or warmth or recognition, and you were perpetually struggling just to avoid scorn and criticism. That's what people who have taken this value to heart experience. They can never, ever win, and the only life outcome is perhaps, and only with incredible effort or luck, to avoid negative feedback for a brief time. As a result, they live in a world of overcast and gloomy skies, with no hope of any sunshine or warmth on the horizon, and depression and despair become their permanent companions. My usual response when I'm faced with someone who is living underneath this painful backdrop is to confront the root of untruth of the game. And I usually recount one of my favorite episodes of the 60s TV show, The Andy Griffith Show. In the episode in question, Andy's son Opie visits the traveling carnival that has rolled into Mayberry and naturally gravitated to the shooting game, as he was known to be a pretty experienced shooter with his paw. Opie ended up eyeballing and getting excited about a newfangled electric shaving razor, and he immediately thinks it would be an incredibly thoughtful gift for Andy's upcoming birthday. The carnies that ran the shooting game booth, however, have concocted a scheme to reduce their risk of running across a string of great shooters who will drain away the prizes. They have bent the sights on the primary shooting rifles that they give the players and just have the ones that actually shoots right and straight. The carnies choose when and whom they give the rifle that you could actually reasonably win with. Opie put his hard-earned money on the counter and was confident he could win the razor for his paw and make him proud. But the carnies handed him one of the rifles with the bent sight, and Opie ended up spending all of his money, hopelessly missing the targets, and he won nothing. Distraught, Opie confided his disappointment in Barney Fife, and Barney eventually broke down and told Sheriff Andy the situation. Annie went to the carnival and quickly figured out that the carnies were switching out the guns and running a crooked game. After having confronted the carnies, he told them that he would send his son back out to shoot one last time, and that he will run them out of town if they don't let Opie win or lose fairly with the good rifle that hasn't been tampered with. They nervously agree, and Opie came back out and won the electric razor for his father and gave it to him proudly as a birthday present. How I use this to combat the depression that people have internalized is to frame this story as an example of how you shouldn't play crooked games and resist taking the bait to try and win prizes that are hopelessly out of reach. Now, I would expect that adults can make this kind of rational decision and decide that they are not going to be baited into trying to get approval that cannot be attained, no matter how hard or how well that they perform for someone's expectations. I do not believe that young children, in the midst of their developmental years, can, without help and guidance, be expected to put aside their intrinsic dependence and just accept that their parents have put a permanent lock on the refrigerator and that they will never be able to get anything worthwhile out of it. The nature of being a child is to believe in our formative years that adults we depend on should tell us who we are and should be very fragile and accepting about what they reflect to us. It would be perfectly reasonable to expect that a youngster confronted with this straight A's only value would take it at face value and assume that it is a legitimate game and that the problem lies with how they shoot the rifle rather than questioning whether it's a crooked game. The therapeutic challenge would be to transition the person sitting in front of you into not chasing the prize up on the shelf because they can't ever win it, and also because they should no longer need outside approval for their self-esteem as fully grown adults. So let's talk about why this whole expected straight A's is a crooked game, so we can effectively dismiss it and replace it with a game that is legit and winnable. The first problem is that an unreasonable scale that never allows for winning and doesn't even respect its own grading. The normal school standard grading scale would be that an A is excellent and a B is actually still above average. And getting that mark means that you still did a good job, performed beyond expectations, and getting that mark still means that you did a great job, performed beyond expectations, and should be happy. And one should be happy and satisfied with that grade. I had a client that worked as an executive for a large financial holding company who came into the office seriously questioning whether he truly deserved this high position. He perceived that he may have been over-promoted into it at too young of an age and level of experience. He wrestled with the feeling that he might be eventually exposed and relieved of duty. He eventually received a public review from a Wall Street holding company that judged his performance as perfectly adequate for the financial position and physical location his company was in. He stated he was very pleased with this review. We ended up discussing how he rightfully perceived that, while others may have seen a rating as adequate, as substandard and possibly insulting. The review was actually the validation he was looking for, as adequate meant to him that he was neither better nor worse than expected, and was judged as being worthy of the position he was in. This evolved into a separate set of conversations about how society has pushed a distorted standard where average is not good enough any longer, but rather that average means now that you are falling behind and is a substandard grade rather than being the middle of the pack. To be sure, the idea of demanding and expecting straight A's in performance is an unrealistic and distorted value that no one should logically embrace because of its perfectionism, and is definitely damaging to those who try and live up to it. It's a product of all or nothing thinking, who the founders of cognitive behavioral therapy rightfully included in their original list of distorted thoughts that provoke depression. It precludes that any degree of success other than 100% as being of no value, and we know that this is logically wrong on any practical level. To accept this as a consumer would be to discount anything good that you have ever accomplished unless it was absolutely spotless, without any single miscue or blemish. I certainly don't accept a perfectionistic grading scale in my own life, and generally grade my own efforts in more of a pass or fail standard. And I believe this is a more logical way of looking at success. One of my regular statements in session when combating the value this chapter is addressing is that not one single employer in the 25 plus years since graduating from my graduate program has asked me about my grade point average, nor one single solitary grade from any class. This usually makes this nor one single solitary grade from any class, and this usually makes the pragmatic point. They are only concerned with whether I successfully graduated and seeing the proof that I passed the program in the way of a diploma or a transcript. From a parenting perspective, as the potential producer of this value, using this value is an understandable general principle by which you could motivate children to understand the need for hard work and the pursuit of excellence. I have no qualms with this idea in general, as this is a good goal in theory. The underlying issue is that this is a way of assessing performance, and giving the reward of acceptance relies too heavily on results. One of the recent trends in parenting methodology and techniques suggests that one of the most damaging things that you can do is to praise children for traits that they innately have and were born with, such as being smart or talented, that they didn't do anything to earn and didn't work for. Instead, it is suggested that parents should recognize and reward children's efforts, as this is something they create and engineer themselves, apart from whatever genetic gifts they may have been blessed with. To just grade results and place excessive weight on straight A's is to ignore the actual work that one puts into getting the grades, and does not recognize the effort, the self-discipline, the determination, and resilience that was put into the task. Being a die-hard fan and attendee of the Indianapolis 500 since my early childhood, I have always been aware that there is a great difference in the quality of cars and equipment that were in the race due to both available cash and engineering resources. I recently read about the great talent of an unknown and unheralded driver who spent much of the 1970s trying to pilot substandard race cars run on shoestring budgets by undermanned teams into the race and just keep them on the track and mildly competitive against much faster and better developed cars and better funded teams. The trick was that the only ones who were educated about the inner workings and the behind-the-scenes realities of the Indy 500 would even have a clue as to the depths of this man's will. His developed skill and bravery as a driver when he regularly finished near the back of the pack. On a message board I frequent, numerous insiders recalled stories of admiration of how this driver persevered against great odds to put cars they thought were rolling buckets of bolts with underpowered engines into the race and actually giving a decent show for his employers. And how he was an unsung talent who was deserving of so much better in terms of opportunities. If we only gave consideration to the winner of the 500, we would be disregarding the efforts, successes, and failings and performance of every other single driver in the race. This illustrates my point perfectly that judging results alone and looking for perfection overlooks the character traits that are being developed or displayed in the process of trying to achieve these results. As a parent, I do my level best not to react out of perfectionism when my daughter turns over her report card and to recognize any grades over a C with praise and thanksgiving, and to look at the effort and the work and self-discipline that it took to get those marks recorded on that card. It takes effort to not instinctively push for results, but it is a wise effort to undertake. I promise that if you ever end up in my office, I will do my best to recognize your work and your character and your effort in the process rather than focusing solely on the results. Kaniqua had a hard time working her way out of the depressive hole that years and years of trying to achieve an imaginary perfection dug into her, and the underlying realization that even achieving straight A's would only earn her a temporary reprieve from criticism and disappointment and not any meaningful acceptance of praise. With the time, she has started to develop a new and independent grading scale of her own that was much more balanced and objective, and she has now had room for some B's as grades and even some C's, while still seeing herself as doing a good job and being talented and successful in life. As she began to level out her personal grading system, Kaniqua began to feel less despondent and less hopeless about things that she did and how she was doing regarding the relationships she had. Rejecting the inner perfectionist voice was critical to her reducing depressive symptoms. She frequently heard and had to wrestle with her parents' phrase, "straight A's are expected," in her mind for years to come. Luckily for her, she came to see this phrase as the root of her personal misery and hopelessness and took it on, head to head, as the tenet that needed to be repeatedly evicted from her personal space. She eventually became a much less self-critical person who was much more fair in how she saw herself. Her mood and her relationships became lighter and more positive, and she was able to reduce her personal